morning. I'm going to tie a pretty simple pattern but effective pattern this morning. We're going to tie a live floss or floss river bug. We're going to use some flexifloss on this. I've just got a scud hook in my vise with an appropriate size bead. I think I've got a 3/32 bead. It's size 16 hook here in my vise. Bead's going to help it get down in the water for us really well. So I'm going to add a piece of lead here to stick that, kind of tuck it inside the bead. We'll tie that forward to right behind the bead. I'll leave my thread just dangling there. We're just going to take some wraps of the lead until we get ourselves right up behind that bead. You want to make sure you don't use too thick of a lead. This is going to make a nice transition on a tapered body. If your lead's too thick, it's going to make the bug not look quite right. So I'm going to go ahead and tie that in right behind the bead. Pull down on our thread while we pull the lead off there. And from there, I'm just going to take a few wraps to kind of cover up part of those. I don't have to worry too much about covering them up completely because we will be tying a lot of material over the top of where these thread wraps are. And I don't want it to get too thick up here. So I'll just take a few wraps like that, starting to get that transition off the lead back to the bend of the hook, and then we'll just go ahead and proceed touching wraps back down here around the bend. This was one of those patterns where I will reposition the hook. I've got the eye pointing kind of downwards. After we get some of the material tied in and on, we'll reposition that. This just helps, especially when we're tying things in back here behind the bend of the hook here, keep them from sliding all the way off. So back here at the back end, we're going to tie in a piece of red halotinsel. This is kind of a deep red, and we're going to use this to create a butt end on this fly that is just a nice red hot spot on the back. So we're just going to take our thread back down around the bend of the hook. We'll bring it back up. With that done, we'll go ahead and start wrapping this floss, and this is where it's good to have that hook repositioned, because this stuff will just slide all over on you because it's kind of a mylar. You'll want to make sure you avoid the hook point as you're taking these wraps. And I'm going to take wraps going up a lot deeper than they need to be. I'll cover some of these up. I just found it just makes it a little bit easier to make the transition here. So you can see being very careful with the first few wraps is pretty important. From there it goes on pretty easy. Let's back our thread off a little bit here. And we'll tie that halotinsel down. Notice if you put a lot of pressure on the halotinsel, it's going to curl up on you like that. We'll cut off the butt end. So for the bulk of the abdomen here, we're going to just use some live flex. I'm using an olive color here. It's almost like a rubber band. Does a great job in doing these kind of nymph patterns. So we're just going to tie that in right at the top of the shank of our hook here. I'm going to take a couple of wraps to make sure I've got it secure. And then as I take wraps backwards, I don't want to cover up all of that red. And I also want to pull on this floss, which will stretch it and make it so we don't have quite as much buildup as we're making our way back to where we want the live flex body to begin. And I'll be turning my thread counterclockwise a little bit as I do this. That just helps flatten the thread out a little bit. Then I want to make sure I've got a nice good transition up to where we tied our lead in. So we're just building up a tiny little bit of taper here. And with that, we're just going to go ahead and move our thread all the way up. So right here I'm going to go ahead and throw my thread in the bobbin cradle. It just gives me a little bit more free space. The first couple of wraps I take here, I'm going to want to pull that flex pretty tight. You'll get to learn how tight you can actually tie this stuff before it breaks, but by doing it fairly tight, we're going to have smaller segments as we move up towards the bead, and I let off on the tension a little bit. Each one of those segments begins to become much larger and thicker, more distinct. That's going to be good. Go ahead and move our bobbin cradle out of the way here. We'll just take a couple of wraps to secure that material down. Just like that. You could probably fish it just like this, but we're going to go ahead and add a sort of a dubbing collar to it. If you stretch the material before you cut it, it'll suck itself right back down into the wraps and leave hardly anything showing at all. And this is where I'll reposition my hook. I'm going to loosen up my vise a little bit, turn it so that I'm more parallel here with the eye of the hook. So this might be a little overkill, but I'm actually going to use a dubbing loop to put the collar on here. So I'm just going to attach my thread to my dubbing twister here. I'm going to take my thread up over the top, take a couple of wraps around the base of that thread to hold it together. I'm going to just take a few wraps backwards to where I want this kind of collar slash thorax to start. So from here we're just going to loosely place some of that dubbing into our dubbing loop here. And once that's in there, I'm going to go ahead and start spinning. Get a nice spiky rope going here. You can pick at that a little bit. We will probably clean some of those up, but not a lot of them. And from here I'm just going to go ahead and use the rotating feature. I've thrown my bobbin back on the bobbin cradle. I'm going to use this rotating feature here to build this kind of pronounced collar. Nice thing about a dubbing loop is when you've got enough dubbing, you can just stop and tie it off and cut it off. So it makes things a little bit easier. So let's go ahead and take a wrap or two, securing that dubbing loop down. Then I'll just go ahead and turn my vise on its side, and we'll reach in with our scissors. I'll cut that off. With that, I'm going to go ahead and stroke some of these fibers backwards to see if we can get some of them to just lay backwards in that kind of a direction. Some of them we're going to clean up and cut off. I'm just going to take a few wraps like that backwards, starting to build up a small head. We're just going to grab our whip finisher. And cut off our thread. With that, what I will do, like I mentioned before, I like this to look a little buggy, but I don't want these fibers to go completely back towards past the bend of the hook. So I am going to kind of clean up a few of the ones that are just sticking way out there. But don't go overboard, because you do want this thing to look kind of buggy. With that, there you go. It's the Flex river bug. Great pattern. Gets down in the water really fast with that copper tungsten bead, as well as a little bit of lead. Throw a hook in your vise and give this one a shot.